Welcome to Real Talk. We are grateful to have you with us. And thank you, Heather, for the comment that you shared on our Facebook group. She said, another great episode. You inspired me to post a couple of questions to our refrigerator door for my family to ponder this week. How can we help make a fertile ground for each other's seed of faith? And she loved the tree episode. We get a lot of shout outs on the tree episode.
The tree episode. We all like to get earthy, I guess, in our spiritual study.
And it's an invitation for diversity and being more inclusive, right? So thank you, Heather, for that. And thank you for the comments and love. We read your comments and we appreciate them. We don't take them for granted. Another 10 chapters this week, Scott.
That's right.
You made it through last week.
But we're going to finish Alma this week. So Alma is long, 63 chapters, and we're going to finish it this week. So, so there is hope.
Alma 53 through 63, preserved by his marvelous power. So I wrote a little booklet, and it's called Mother to Mother, and it was one of the most sacred things for me to write in my writing career. And this cover really articulates what happened as I wrote, where the women that I wrote about came and shared insights and impressions about their lives. And one section I talk about the stripling warriors and their mothers. And I found it interesting as I was researching for this project that stripling isn't what we think, because the artwork out there makes you think that stripling warriors were all CrossFit athletes.
Like veterans, like 10 years later through CrossFit.
Yes.
And,
Yes, not true. If you look at the dictionary from Joseph Smith's time, which is a really helpful app to have on your phone when you're studying the Book of Mormon or even the D&C next year, because you can see context of why maybe Joseph was using the word that he used in translation. Stripling means a tall, slender youth, one that shoots up suddenly, a lad. So a stripling youth is really, think about those teacher's quorum kids in your ward maybe, that as I wrote in Mother to Mother, they are leaving boyhood, but they're still in that awkward phase and they're approaching manhood. And instead of thinking of them as these Olympic athletes, think about what their mothers must have felt like, sending their maybe acne-faced, awkward teenage, that age, right? Where they're coming into their own, but they're not quite there yet, into battle. That's a really, I think, important shift to have an understanding of what these moms must have felt.
Yeah, this is a Book of Mormon David and Goliath story where if you just look at the physical attributes and numbers, there's no way they should have been able to do what they were able to do. This is a great story of grace and about how grace can influence us when we feel awkward, uncomfortable. And in fact, one of my favorite things, I'll put up those strong pictures of the stripling warriors, and then I ask my students to, let's give a battle cry from these guys, and it's like, yeah, you know, I get the football players, they're like stand up and flex, like, yeah, you know, and all of that. And then we explained, well, actually, they're probably more like your teachers in priest quorum, you know.
Their voices are still changing.
Yeah, and like, let's do a battle cry of the teachers quorum, and it is hilarious to do. Yeah.
Do you want to do one?
No.
Oh.
No.
Well, I think as you start Alma 53, I think that's an important thing to share, especially if you have teens in the house, that, listen, you're trying to figure this out. Can you imagine if you got a call to go fight a literal war right now? And really, all departing missionaries, I've had this conversation with them randomly in Walmart or whatever. Like, you don't have it all figured out. You're not sure. We read this story and we retell it in a way that's these absolutes. And as we jump into Alma 56, it talks about how they had never fought, but they didn't fear death. And they did not think more upon the liberty of their fathers than they did upon their lives. Yea, they did think more upon, not didn't. And so they were worried. By their example of their parents, I think they were fortified. And it talks about how their mothers had taught them and they didn't doubt. I'm going to just say that one of the big reasons I included their mothers in this project, Mother to Mother, is because we have, I think, a misunderstanding of who these moms were. We tend to think of them as Pinterest perfect, right? They were the moms that had the greatest come follow me lessons, never missed family home evening. They did indexing every week. All their kids went on missions. They, paid their tithing. Their kids did service instead of like playing video games, right? That's why these stripling warriors never doubted, because their mothers were perfect. And that's actually not true. So as we take a look at who these mothers are, I think it's super helpful to know in in Alma 57 that as they were at this point in the story converted and faith-focused, they hadn't always been. These are the recovering addicts. These are the anti-Nephi Lehis who had lived during Captain Moroni's time, but previously had husbands and themselves that were very war-focused. Yeah. And so they had raised children in a way that I think is uniquely inviting to me to not hide my imperfections.
Yeah.
Did their boys go into battle? Without doubt, and with loving their parents more than their own lives, because their parents had been vulnerable in the way they had raised their kids.
Yeah.
Had they talked about their conversion experience so openly that their boys knew what source to turn to. I think it's worth considering that our imperfections, we have kind of pieced that apart on Real Talk, that Lehi, that Alma, right? These parents,
Alma the older and younger,
really share with their kids, listen, I know Jesus because I almost lost my life.
Yeah.
And I believe these imperfect, non-Pinterest moms were the moms that can inspire this kind of dedication and faith in the face of war in boys that were still figuring out their own faith. You have some really great insights about what we see play out.
Yeah, so in one of their battles, they go out and it's a bloody, it's tough. And it's one of those, it's in Alma 57, and it talks about how at the end of this, Helaman calls them to go out and find those who are wounded. And it says, it came to pass that there, so this is starting in verse 25 of Alma 57, that there were 200 out of my 2,060 who had fainted because of the loss of blood. Okay, now pause for a second there. As you're looking over a battlefield, first of all, the trauma of that would be really tough. But they're looking out across this battlefield of dead bodies, both Nephites and Lamanites. And they don't know yet that there's 200 of their brothers who are still alive. And so how do you tell the difference? Because it says that they had fainted because of the loss of blood. But how do you tell the difference between someone who is dead and someone who has fainted due to loss of blood? You actually have to get out in that battlefield. You have to get down on your hands and knees in the mud and the muck and the blood, and you have to check for pulses and see if they're breathing. And many weren't, but many were. And they had to go through, and I just think about what this must have been like for them. And then when they found one of their brothers who was still alive, breathing, yet passed out, the joy, I found another one, my friend is still alive. And just the joy they must have felt in the tragedy. These are boys that knew how to seek out those who were lost. And I think about that in terms of a ministering lesson. And it reminds me really quickly in Mark chapter 2 of those 4 friends who have a paralyzed friend who's on his bed. They can't get him into the home where Jesus is. And so they won't give up, even though there's not enough room for them. There's no room for me in that room with Jesus. But I don't care. I'm going to make room. They figure out, they tear the roof off of this building. I don't know if that was culturally a normal thing to do. I don't think so, but maybe. They tear the roof off for their friend. And Jesus says something so fascinating in there. He says, I am going to heal you, not only forgive you of your sins, but I'm also going to heal you of palsy. And it doesn't say because of your faith. It says because of the faith of your friends, because of their faith. Those 2 stories to me are so beautifully written about ministering, getting down in the mud and the muck of someone else's life and just saying, how can I help you? How can I support you? Tell me what's going on. Let me check your pulse. How do you feel? What's going on here? Not trying to necessarily fix it, but to make sure they know they're not alone and that there's someone there for them. I think it's one of the most emotional scenes. I just imagine if you asked Helaman in a fireside, what did you notice as you stood up there and watched these boys? I don't think he'd be able to talk. I think he would just weep, because this is like something that I think we could pause here and just think, what does it feel like to go from person to person? No, they're gone. They're gone. But this one's alive.
And as you were talking, I had that image of we do really need to get close to see someone, right? The greatest service, like you said, isn't to save them, but to see them.
Yeah.
You can't always...
Pause, hold on. We got to stop. The greatest service is not necessarily to save them,
but to see them.
But to see them. I like that.
When someone sees me, right, they can't fix my stuff, but you have to get close to know that.
Yeah.
And I've said with the ministering changes, right, that there's so often that we don't know what that looks like. And I always say, how do we know we're one heart and one mind if you don't even know what's happening in our lives, right? If we're not sharing that. The other impression I had is all these return missionaries. I have a son who came home from an intense, beautiful, wonderful 2 years in Africa. I don't know a missionary that comes home that doesn't have some scars, some bleeding. And I think oftentimes we're like, good job, you served. But we don't sit with them and say, how are you doing now?
Yeah.
How did it feel to sacrifice 18 months or 2 years of your life? Or our COVID missionaries that we love so much, that went out, came back, got reassigned, went out, came back. Some didn't go back out. That as you were sharing that image, I'm like, that's what our return missionaries need. They need someone to sit with them, no matter how long they serve in the field, to say, are you breathing? How are you doing? Are you wounded? I love that
And
insight.
how can I help?
And how can I help?
Where's the pain?
Yeah.
I'm here.
Do you want to talk about it?
And how do they know that those young men are there? Because they are covered in the blood and the mud of a battlefield.
Yes.
They can just look at them and say, they know what this feels like. There's someone I can trust.
You talked briefly about the fact that the conditions were horrible, right? The troops are starving. And that leads into one of the greatest stories. I think I reflect on this story more often in my relationships than any other Book of Mormon story, because it's based on a misunderstanding. And it's based on vulnerability. And it's Moroni and Pahoran, and they really are having vulnerable stories play out, but they can't text each other, they can't email each other, they can't say, hey, I'm feeling this, you must be feeling this, hey, how can I help you out today? They're away from each other, and they're both struggling for different reasons. And because of that, Moroni is really triggered.
Yeah.
He's really frustrated. He's very protective, and he's irritated. He feels very abandoned. And Alma 60 picks up with this story.
Yeah, and I wonder if we ask Moroni right now if he's okay that it's in there. I think he would be like, can we omit that?
TMI.
Can we take away the letter from Pahoran? But another Mormon puts it in. Mormon does, and he's like, no, this is important to realize.
And I think it's because it plays out in my life almost every day. If I'm not careful, the stories I'm telling myself, I just had this experience with someone where I had to check the facts. And there's a delay here in this story. And that's where the problem is. Because Pahoran is over here having a vulnerable experience. Moroni writes this letter. And I love what Neil A. Maxwell says. Given the intense mutual devotion of disciples, discussions as to how best to move the Lord's work along are bound to produce tactical differences on occasion, just as in the episode sometimes scolding occurs that is later shown to be unjustified. And basically that's what Moroni's doing.
Yeah.
He's like, dude.
I think he calls him an embarrassment.
He's like,
at one point.
You have left me out to dry.
Yeah.
And by the way, do you know what our army has been doing to try to take care of you?
Yeah.
And Pahoran to me is like the great hero in his humility.
Maybe that's the reason the story's in there. Pahoran vote one. He's like, put it in there. I want to show meekness.
Meekness is greatness, and it's not weakness. Meekness isn't weakness, but this is Pahoran's great moment where he chooses not to be offended. What are your thoughts on how Moroni really calls him a traitor? And
he's like, once we're done with the Lamanites, we're coming to you. And that would be one of the scariest things of all time.
Right.
To know Moroni, know what he's about, and be like, uh-oh, his wrath is focused toward me. But Pahoran knows Moroni, and he says, I know your heart. I know who you are, and I love you. This to me actually represents, and I'm just having a moment, I hope that I say this all right, of how we approach, of how God responds to us when we say, what are you doing? I am starving. Where is the manna from heaven? Where is all these miracles?
Yes.
And God is like, I know your heart. I understand you. And I am grateful that you have this spirit. I'm grateful that you wrote me. I'm okay that you wrote me this letter. Even though there's a lot of misunderstanding in there, I'm so glad. Because I love you.
Because Pahoran was worried too that Moroni had bailed maybe.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm abandoned as well. And his response to him is so beautiful about how we can maneuver through the stories in our head and have generous assumptions.
Yeah.
He has generous assumptions.
About Moroni. And we should always have those with God.
Right.
Always.
I love that
And
insight.
one last thing with this, and let me just say that I had an experience in a training once that really changed me. I will never forget it. And it was someone talking about being marginalized in their profession. And it was a female seminary teacher, which you can imagine would be really tough. And in a profession where it's primarily men. And that would be a very difficult thing, I imagine, to deal with. And she was talking a little bit about this, and she was sharing some stories that, I mean, it made my jaw drop about how she had been treated as in different capacities. And she said something I hope I never forget. She said, what I've learned through all these situations is I can choose to be offended or I can choose to educate. And I simply have chosen to educate. And so that's what I do now. And she educated me in that moment. And I thought, what a beautiful way of handling it. That's what Pahoran does. He could choose to be offended. He had every right to be. Because Moroni was wrong.
Calls him out.
He's wrong.
Yeah.
And Pahoran doesn't choose to be offended. He chooses to educate. And he educates out of love for Moroni and who he is as a person. And so I think in church, there are so many reasons to be offended. Like, I think it's one of the great tests of members of the church is to be offended by others in church. I really do. I think it's one of the great tests of being a member of the church.
Is it Elder Holland who says it must frustrate God to have all these imperfect people to work with, right? And Neil A. Maxwell's quote that I shared is that really our intention is what? The conversation I just had in this similar vein is both of our whys were pure. Like Moroni and Pahoran are both fighting for the same cause.
Yeah.
The problem is that in that zeal and sometimes that effort, I love the example you just shared, Scott, that what a loss for the seminary program if she wasn't able to maneuver through those feelings of being marginalized. What a loss to not have her voice. And so for her to see clearly, listen, this is my why. I'm going to choose out of being offended. It's not to distract from the fact that those are real feelings, but I'm going to stay in the boat. I'm going to stay here and keep sharing my voice. I really appreciate that Moroni and Pahoran were willing to be vulnerable and share their experience, because it's a pattern for us on how to resolve issues. And that's kind of our...
And that's our invitation, is just going to be, how can you approach a difficult conversation with the intention of cultivating understanding? I'm going to say it again. We chose these words on purpose.
Very specific.
So let me say it again. How can you approach a difficult conversation with the intention of cultivating understanding? And that most likely will mean you need to ask more questions than you're used to.
And you gave an example.
One of my favorite questions in counsel is help me understand, or tell me more. When someone says something, they're usually telling you maybe 20% of what they believe, the tip of the iceberg, 10%. Well, tell me more. Tell me more about why you've arrived at that opinion and feeling and conclusion. Or help me understand. So you said this, help me understand that better. So what I'm hearing is you're saying this.
Yes.
You know, am I right? What am I missing? We need to ask more questions so we don't make these false assumptions based on misinformation, because we do it all the time.
And what a great way to use Come Follow Me this week in your homes. The next time you're triggered and irritated, which might be 5 minutes from now.
It might be right now.
It might be right now because they're not watching Real Talk and being quiet, right? You can turn to your kids and say, can you tell me what's going on?
Yeah.
What's going on with you right now? I want to understand. What a different approach than what Sweet Moroni did.
Yeah.
You are, right?
And if it doesn't change, I'm coming after you.
And I'm coming after you.
Well, thank you so much for watching another episode of Real Talk. Hopefully you've enjoyed the war chapters with us and you've got some meaning out of here. We love you, and thank you so much again for your support.